Hi everyone, from which country are you watching this video and what time is it there? Write in the comments. In the fall of 1998, just as the crisp October air began to settle over the Appalachian Mountains, Emily Harris, a 25-year-old journalist, decided to spend a weekend at Ravenwood Cabin. Located deep in the woods of West Virginia, the cabin was an isolated, rustic retreat she had rented to finish her latest article, a piece on local legends and ghost stories. The cabin sat alone at the end of a narrow dirt road. It was small, with weathered wooden walls and a stone chimney that puffed faint wisps of smoke into the pale evening sky. Surrounding it were towering oaks, their branches clawing at the darkening heavens, and a carpet of fallen leaves that crackled underfoot. Emily arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the forest in shades of amber and gray. She unpacked her things quickly, bringing in her laptop, a few notebooks, and some groceries. As night fell, the cabin's atmosphere shifted. The quiet, once tranquil, now felt oppressive. The only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards beneath her feet. At around 10 p.m., while typing by the light of a dim desk lamp, Emily felt it, a chill sweeping through the room. She glanced at the window, expecting to see it open, but it was tightly shut. The fire in the stone hearth flickered erratically, as though caught in an unseen breeze. Dismissing it as the draftiness of an old cabin, she refocused on her work. Then came the knock. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. 3 soft taps at the front door. Emily froze, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Her nearest neighbor was miles away, and she hadn't seen another soul since she arrived. Heart pounding, she grabbed her flashlight and approached the door. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. No response. She opened the door a crack and shone the flashlight into the darkness. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and swirling leaves. There was no sign of anyone, or anything. She shut the door firmly, bolting it this time, and tried to laugh off her unease. An hour later, the knocking returned, louder this time. 3 sharp, deliberate raps. Emily's pulse quickened. She checked her phone, no signal. Her flashlight flickered and died just as she reached for it. Gripping the nearest object, a fire poker, she steeled herself and flung the door open. The porch was empty, but the air was colder than before, biting at her skin. As she stepped back inside, she noticed something chilling, muddy footprints leading from the door to the middle of the living room. She hadn't noticed them before, and they certainly weren't hers. The prints ended abruptly in front of her desk, where her laptop now displayed a message she hadn't typed. "You shouldn't have come." Her blood ran cold. Panicking, Emily grabbed her car keys and bolted outside, intent on leaving. As she approached her car, she saw them, 2 figures standing at the edge of the woods, their faces obscured by shadow. They didn't move, but she could feel their gaze, heavy and unrelenting. Without hesitation, she jumped into her car, turned the key, and sped down the dirt road. In her rearview mirror, she caught one last glimpse of the cabin. The 2 figures were now standing on the porch, watching her leave. Emily never returned to Ravenwood Cabin, and for years, she couldn't shake the memory of that weekend. Locals later told her stories of a couple who had disappeared in the area decades ago, their cabin rumored to be cursed. Whether it was their spirits she encountered or something else entirely, Emily couldn't say. But she knew one thing for certain. Something in those woods didn't want her there. After that harrowing night, Emily vowed to put as much distance as possible between herself and Ravenwood Cabin. She arrived back in Charleston, West Virginia, just before dawn, physically exhausted and emotionally shaken. Despite the safety of her small apartment in the city, she couldn't escape the creeping dread that followed her. That first night back home, Emily struggled to sleep. Every sound, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional groan of her apartment's old plumbing, set her on edge. She kept replaying the events in her mind, the chilling message on her laptop, the muddy footprints, the shadowy figures. What did they want? Why had they singled her out? 2 days later, her editor, Mark, called, asking about the article she'd promised. Her voice wavered as she explained that she needed more time. Curious, Mark pressed her for details, but she only said she'd encountered something strange. Sensing her unease, he suggested she take a few days off, and Emily gratefully agreed. That night, as Emily tried once more to work through her terror, she decided to review the few photographs she'd taken of the cabin and its surroundings. Flipping through her camera's memory card, her heart stopped cold. In one photo, of the cabin's front door, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A faint figure stood just inside the window, its face pressed against the glass. It was pale and blurred, as though half-formed, but unmistakably humanoid. Emily's breath quickened. She hadn't seen anyone there when she took the picture. Another image, a shot of the forest surrounding the cabin, revealed more, shadowy shapes lurking in the treeline. At first, they seemed like tricks of the light or darkened patches of foliage, but as she zoomed in, she saw the same faint, ghostly forms she had seen that night. Terrified, Emily tried to convince herself that her mind was playing tricks on her. But as she powered down the camera, her laptop screen lit up on its own. Her desktop, once cluttered with files, now displayed a single folder she hadn't created. Its title chilled her to the core. "They're watching." Hands trembling, she opened the folder. Inside were dozens of video files, none of which she had recorded. She clicked on the first one. It was a shaky recording of her arriving at the cabin, unloading her belongings, and walking inside. The angle suggested it had been filmed from the treeline. She clicked another. This one showed her sleeping on the couch, her chest rising and falling steadily. The camera panned slowly as though someone or something was moving around her. Emily slammed the laptop shut and grabbed her phone to call the police, but just as she dialed, the screen went dark. No signal again. She looked out her window, her heart racing, and saw them. The same shadowy figures standing under a street lamp across from her building. This time, there were more of them. Panic overtook her. She grabbed her car keys and bolted for the door. As she raced down the hallway of her apartment building, the lights flickered, plunging the corridor into brief moments of pitch black. By the time she reached her car, her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, she didn't look back. She drove aimlessly, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Hours passed before she pulled into the parking lot of a 24-hour diner in a nearby town. Inside, she ordered coffee, her hands still trembling as she explained her ordeal to the kind, older waitress behind the counter. The waitress listened patiently, her expression growing darker with each detail. When Emily finished, the woman leaned in close and whispered, "You're not the first. And you won't be the last." Emily stared at her in shock. "What do you mean?" The waitress sighed. "That cabin. It's cursed. Anyone who stays there sees them. Sometimes they follow you, sometimes they don't. But once they've noticed you," she trailed off, her eyes darting to the window. Emily turned to look, and her heart stopped. Standing just outside the diner's parking lot, bathed in the pale glow of the flickering streetlights, were the shadowy figures. This time, they were closer. And they weren't alone. Emily could barely breathe as she stared at the figures standing outside the diner. Their silhouettes seemed to waver, like shadows cast by a flickering flame, but their presence was undeniable. The waitress placed a trembling hand on Emily's shoulder. "You need to leave," the older woman whispered urgently. "They don't come this close unless they're ready." "Ready for what?" Emily asked, her voice cracking. The waitress didn't answer. Instead, she reached behind the counter and handed Emily a small, worn crucifix and a silver flask. "Holy water," she explained. "It might slow them down. But if they're after you," she trailed off again, her eyes clouded with fear. Emily's instincts screamed at her to run, but she felt rooted to the spot. Her gaze flicked back to the window. The figures were gone. The parking lot was empty. "Where did they go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The waitress stepped back, her face pale. "They don't just disappear," she said. "They're here." At that moment, the fluorescent lights in the diner flickered violently before plunging the room into darkness. A collective gasp rose from the few other patrons, followed by the sound of shattering glass as the front window cracked. Emily fumbled for the holy water, gripping the flask tightly in one hand and the crucifix in the other. Then she heard it, a slow, deliberate knock on the diner door. 3 times, just like at the cabin. The air grew icy, and Emily's breath puffed out in visible clouds. The other patrons scrambled to the back of the diner, while the waitress muttered prayers under her breath. Emily stood frozen, her eyes locked on the door. The knock came again, louder this time. The door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but the empty parking lot. Yet the oppressive sense of being watched was stronger than ever. And then they came. One by one, the shadowy figures stepped into the diner. Their forms were clearer now, humanoid but wrong. Their limbs were too long, their faces featureless save for deep, hollow voids where eyes should have been. They moved slowly but deliberately, as though savoring the fear that gripped the room. Emily backed away, holding up the crucifix. "Stay back," she screamed, her voice breaking. The nearest figure paused, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying her. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, it spoke. "You belong to us now." Emily felt a surge of cold rush through her body as the lights flickered back on, momentarily blinding her. When her vision cleared, the figures were gone, and the diner was eerily silent. The waitress approached cautiously, her face ashen. "They don't give up easily," she said quietly. "You need to end this." "How?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "There's only one way," the waitress replied. "You have to go back. To the cabin. Whatever you did to bring them here, you need to undo it." The idea of returning to Ravenwood Cabin made Emily's stomach churn, but she knew she had no other choice. The shadowy figures weren't just haunting her, they were consuming her life, and she couldn't let them win. The next evening, armed with a flashlight, the crucifix, and the holy water, Emily drove back to the Appalachian woods. The narrow dirt road seemed darker and more foreboding than she remembered, the trees closing in like skeletal hands. When she arrived, the cabin looked exactly as she had left it, dark, cold, and menacing. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Inside, everything was as she had left it, the fire poker on the floor, her laptop on the desk, the muddy footprints frozen in place. But now a new detail caught her eye, a small wooden box sitting on the hearth. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The box was old, its surface carved with strange symbols she didn't recognize. Taking a deep breath, she opened it. Inside was a single piece of parchment, yellowed with age. Scrawled across it in jagged handwriting were the words, "They are bound here. Release them or join them." Emily realized the truth. The shadowy figures weren't tormenting her for no reason. They were bound to the cabin, trapped by some ancient force. By coming here, she had disturbed their prison, and now they wanted her to take their place. With shaking hands, she uncorked the flask of holy water and poured it over the box. The air erupted with a deafening roar, and the cabin began to shake violently. The shadowy figures appeared again, emerging from the walls, their forms writhing and twisting. Emily held up the crucifix and shouted, "Be gone!" The figures let out an unearthly wail before collapsing into black smoke, which swirled into the box. The symbols on its surface glowed briefly before fading, and then all was silent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time in days, Emily felt a sense of peace. She left the cabin without looking back, vowing never to return. Though the shadowy figures never appeared to her again, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had only postponed the inevitable. Somewhere deep in the woods, Ravenwood Cabin still stood, waiting for its next visitor. And the box? She had left it there, unopened, buried under the ashes of the cabin's dying fire. Months passed, and Emily slowly began piecing her life back together. She returned to her journalism job, though she avoided writing about anything remotely paranormal. The experience at Ravenwood Cabin was something she kept locked away in her mind, a dark memory she refused to revisit. But the peace didn't last. One chilly December evening, Emily was at her desk, editing an article, when her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Why did you leave us?" Her blood ran cold. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. She tried to tell herself it was just a cruel prank, but deep down, she knew better. The next few days were uneventful, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At home, she would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision. Shadows that disappeared the moment she turned her head. Objects began to shift subtly, a chair slightly out of place, her keys moved from the counter to the table. One night, as she lay in bed, she woke to the sound of faint whispers. They were low and indecipherable, like a distant chorus of voices just beyond the walls. Heart pounding, she grabbed the holy water she kept on her nightstand and sprinkled it around the room. The whispers ceased, but the oppressive feeling of dread lingered. The next morning, Emily decided she couldn't live like this anymore. She drove to the local library to research the symbols she had seen on the box in the cabin. After hours of scouring dusty old texts and obscure folklore, she found a match. The symbols were part of an ancient binding ritual, meant to trap malevolent entities in a specific location. But there was a catch. The binding wasn't permanent. If someone disturbed the site, whether intentionally or not, the entities could escape, attaching themselves to the intruder. To stop them, the ritual had to be completed again, using the same symbols and materials. Emily realized her mistake. Destroying the box hadn't set the spirits free, it had tethered them to her. Determined to end the haunting once and for all, Emily contacted a local historian, Margaret Owens, who specialized in Appalachian folklore. Margaret was skeptical at first, but agreed to help after hearing Emily's story and seeing the photographs she had taken at the cabin. "I'll help you," Margaret said, "but this won't be easy. The spirits are bound to you now, which means they'll fight back. You'll need to return to the cabin and perform the ritual there." Emily's stomach churned. "What happens if we don't succeed?" Margaret's face darkened. "Then they'll take you." The two women prepared carefully, gathering the necessary items: salt, candles, herbs, and a freshly carved replica of the box, etched with the binding symbols. On a cold, moonless night in late December, they made their way back to Ravenwood Cabin. The cabin looked even more decrepit than before, as if the very woods around it had started to reclaim it. The air was thick with an unnatural silence, broken only by the crunch of their footsteps on the frost-covered ground. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. Shadows danced across the walls, moving in ways that didn't align with the flickering candlelight. As they set up for the ritual, the temperature dropped rapidly, and faint whispers began to echo through the room. Margaret drew a protective circle of salt around them and began chanting the incantation. Emily held the box tightly, her hands trembling. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of anguished screams. The shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming humanoid shapes with hollow, staring voids where their eyes should have been. They lunged at the circle, but the salt held them back, for now. "Hurry!" Emily shouted, her voice shaking. Margaret's chanting grew louder, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. The shadows writhed and howled, their forms growing more defined with each passing second. One of them reached for Emily, its long, claw-like hand stopping just inches from her face as it hit the invisible barrier of the salt. Finally, Margaret finished the incantation and gestured for Emily to place the box in the center of the circle. Emily hesitated for only a moment before setting it down. As Margaret poured the holy water over the box, the shadows let out an ear-piercing scream. The room erupted in blinding light, and for a moment, Emily felt as if she were floating. When the light faded, the cabin was silent. The shadows were gone, and the air felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted. Margaret exhaled deeply, her face pale but relieved. "It's done," she said. Emily never returned to Ravenwood Cabin again. She and Margaret left the Appalachian woods that night, both shaken but alive. The haunting stopped, and for the first time in months, Emily felt like she could breathe again. Though she moved on with her life, she couldn't completely forget what had happened. Occasionally, she would catch a glimpse of a shadow moving in the corner of her eye or hear faint whispers in the dead of night. She could only hope that the ritual had worked, for good this time. But somewhere, deep in the darkest part of her mind, she couldn't shake the fear that they were still watching. Years passed, and Emily worked hard to put the Ravenwood experience behind her. She moved to a different city, leaving West Virginia and its haunted woods far behind. She no longer wrote articles about local legends or ghost stories, focusing instead on mundane topics like travel and lifestyle. Her nights were mostly quiet, her days uneventful. But on the anniversary of her return from Ravenwood, something changed. It was a bitterly cold night in early January. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, blanketing her small Chicago apartment in a layer of stillness. Emily had just finished a long day of writing and was settling into bed when she heard it, soft, deliberate, and unmistakable. 3 knocks. They came from the front door. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the clock on her nightstand, 3:15 a.m. No one should have been outside in this weather, let alone at this hour. She sat up slowly, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered to herself. "It's not real. It's not them." But then it came again. Knock. Knock. Knock, asterisk, asterisk. The sound was louder this time, more insistent. Emily forced herself to her feet and crept toward the door, her body trembling. She peered through the peephole, expecting to see nothing. Instead, she saw them. The shadowy figures stood just outside her door, their featureless faces turned toward her. Their forms seemed more solid now, more real than they had been in the past. One of them raised a hand and knocked again, sending an icy chill down her spine. Emily stumbled back, her mind racing. She grabbed the crucifix she kept by the door and clutched it tightly. "Leave me alone," she screamed. The knocking stopped. Silence filled the apartment. For a moment, Emily dared to hope that it was over. But then, from behind her, she heard the faintest whisper. "We found you." Emily spun around, her eyes darting wildly. The shadows weren't outside anymore. They were inside. They loomed in the corners of her apartment, their hollow voids for eyes staring directly at her. The air grew impossibly cold, and Emily felt her strength leave her. She dropped to her knees, clutching the crucifix as tears streamed down her face. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It leaned down, its face inches from hers. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, it said, "You were never free." The room plunged into darkness, and Emily's scream echoed into the void. Emily was never seen again. When her friends and family reported her missing, the police found her apartment locked from the inside. The only trace of her was a single muddy footprint in the middle of her living room floor. The story of Emily Harris became another local legend, whispered about in hushed tones. Some claimed she had fallen victim to her own curiosity, while others believed the spirits of Ravenwood Cabin had finally claimed her. And somewhere, deep in the Appalachian woods, the cabin still stands. Waiting. Watching. Would you like me to elaborate on this conclusion or add additional perspectives?